Thanks, Dave, for inviting me, and it's a great honor and pleasure to be here. The title of my talk today is based on the title of my book, which is currently out, and I will sign anybody's copy who wishes till my hand falls off. Life and Death on Mars, the New Mars Synthesis. Let me get going here. I'm going to be talking about the Rosetta Stone of Mars. I'll be explaining what that is for those who are not familiar with the Rosetta Stone, and how we ended up on Mars. How did we end up in this place in history that we are at right now? I'll talk about actually confirmation of life on Mars, and then the new Mars synthesis. I actually swapped those two parts of the talk. And then I will talk about how we are not alone. We have to adjust to a new life in a living cosmos. And I'll talk about how we should respond to that, and then I'll summarize. We want to begin in ancient Egypt, in ancient times, and I want you to kind of think back to the mindset of our ancient forebears, especially in Egypt, which was such a high civilization. And from Egypt, we have messages, but they were written in a complex script that we still don't fully understand. But the hieroglyphic writing was a riddle to everyone. And yet, if you go down to Egypt and you look in the various places where the hieroglyphs just cover the walls with all this complex writing, and it's a message. It's a message from the past to us. And it not only conveys just information, but it also conveys their mental life of people in ancient times. So it was very important to try and decipher that. And the key to deciphering that is a stone called the Rosetta Stone. It was discovered in a place called Rosetta, Egypt, by a French soldier who was part of Napoleon's expedition to try and build a big empire, and they were trying to conquer Egypt. And they were prevented from doing so by the British. But this Rosetta Stone was found in Egypt in 1799, and it's got 3 written speeches that are actually the same speech. It's a proclamation from one of the Greek kings of Egypt, Ptolemies, and it's the same speech in 3 different methods of writing. So since they understood one of the languages is Greek, and they understood classical Greek, they slowly began to decipher, chunk by chunk, what the Egyptian hieroglyphs were when they were rendered into Greek. And this was just a complete breakthrough. By the way, it took them like 50 years to figure out how to decipher. Even though they had the stone, it took them 50 years to unravel the riddle. But the Rosetta Stone is symbolic of getting ancient knowledge moved into the modern time. And it's also symbolic of a stone that basically tells you a big story. And I want you to just kind of meditate on that concept. Messages from the past that we can't decipher, and then suddenly a stone comes along and tells us how to unravel the riddle. Of course, the great riddle for us in modern times is the planet Mars. It's a red desert planet. If you want to know what Mars is like, imagine a high desert like New Mexico or Eastern Oregon, where I grew up. And of course, then we live on Earth, but if you look at Earth from space, you get a first clue. Areas of Earth that are desert, that are not covered with vegetation or clouds or ocean, are bright red. And we know why the soil, the deserts of Earth are bright red. They're highly oxidized. They've been exposed to, the soil has been exposed to oxygen. When a volcano erupts, it puts out a black lava basalt, and that's iron in its lowest oxidation state. It's called the ferrous state. As the rock is weathered and eroded, it turns into red clay, red Georgia clay, and that red clay is full of ferric iron, the same highly oxidized iron in our blood. That's why they call it hematite. And as it turns out, Earth gets its red color from hematite, highly oxidized iron. And so we know why Earth is red, and now we've found that Mars is red for the same reason. The soil was exposed to high levels of oxygen at some time in its past. We also know that on Mars, the place is covered with a spiderwork of old water channels that are dried up. They're like desert wadis on Earth. And you can see in this picture, this crater was once a lake, and the water came out of this, formed a river channel apparently flowing for millions of years to erode through this hard rock, and then formed a delta, where this was apparently a large body of standing water, an arm of a sea or ocean that used to exist on Mars. So you see evidence that not only did liquid water flow on Mars, it flowed for millions and millions of years, forming deltas and river networks. So that's part of the mystery we see for Mars. I was one of the first people to point out at a scientific conference that the north of Mars seemed to be an ocean basin. You must understand that science is very conservative. It tends to, somebody will suggest a new idea, and it's very rare that it will be embraced immediately. You can write 2 + 2 = 4 on a blackboard at a scientific conference, and people will say, I'm not impressed by this. And basically, they will retreat to their cave back in academia and think about it for a long time, and then say, well, the answer is close. And Mars science is probably the most conservative of all the branches of science because of its implications for our place in the universe, exobiology. So Mars science is very conservative. I suggested that people had stared at the same evidence I had for many, many years and wouldn't say the word ocean. I got up in front of a conference and said the word ocean, and then suddenly everyone was saying ocean. So I consider that a great triumph of science. And I'll tell you why I could look at Mars and see that that was an ocean, an old ocean basin, the part in blue. But first, you must also realize that Mars is covered with sedimentary layers, and they are bright red, just like the surface. That indicates the surface of Mars is not just oxidized. The sedimentary rocks that go down for a kilometer everywhere on Mars are also highly oxidized. Mars had oxygen for a long time. It had and those sediments were laid down by water. That's why they formed layers, because they used to be old lake bottom. And we can compare that with the Grand Canyon on Earth. What the Grand Canyon is doing is giving you a cross-section of an old ocean that used to exist in part of America about the time of the dinosaurs, called the Inland Sea. And those flat sediments are because that rock was laid down in water. That's why it's flat. So we have a Grand Canyon on Earth that's about half a kilometer deep. On Mars, the Valles Marineris is 5 kilometers deep. So this is a planet that looks like it's had a geologic history that dwarfs the Earth's. So we have mysteries. Why does Mars look red looking like it had a past oxygen atmosphere? The only way you can make oxygen in large amounts is life. Oxygen is one of the most reactive gases in the universe. It binds to everything, and it's very difficult to free it unless you have life, photosynthesis, to free oxygen, basically from water and carbon dioxide. Next question, why does Mars have a young ocean basin? That ocean basin I just showed you, you'll notice it has very few craters in it. That's a sign that it's very young. The ocean is on the youngest part of Mars, not the ancient part of Mars. People would tell you, oh, well, the water just flowed on Mars in very ancient times. That's the conservatism of Mars science speaking. Actually, they know good and well that the ocean is on the young part of Mars. That means that ocean was there for most of Mars' geologic history. 4 billion years of ocean, perhaps. The same as on Earth, roughly. So, what was Mars' past climate history? Now, there is a Rosetta Stone on Mars, and that is the face of Mars, the face in Cydonia. Here's a recent picture of it taken in 2001. Of course, it still looks like a face. The government has done everything it could to convince everybody it doesn't look like a face. But actually, this is just this picture was taken in 2001, long after the so-called cat box face that they released. You must understand, let's say hypothetically there's a UFO cover-up. That means anytime the government finds anything suggesting intelligent life, whether it's a radio signal or a carved face on Mars, they're going to explain it away. And hard-boiled reporters, investigative reporters I've talked to, they don't believe the government even if it tells them the time of day. But on Mars, or matters of UFOs, they show a childlike credulity. So, however, if you look at this face on Mars, suddenly you know what the climate history of Mars was. You know what the past history of Mars was. It was like Earth and led to an artifact, a carved artifact carved by humanoids like live on Earth. That's the simplest explanation. Life arose on Mars like it did on Earth, and so did intelligence, and finally you had archaeology. And once you know that, then you understand the past of Mars. The face of Mars suggests Mars was Earth-like for a long period, supporting life and evolution of that life, just like it did on Earth. The present state of Mars, however, suggests that Mars suffered a climatic catastrophe. Mars used to be like Earth, and now it isn't anymore. So that tells you not only was there life on Mars, there was death on Mars. Massive death. However, you don't just need to look at the Mars face, which is very controversial and makes people very upset. You can look at all sorts of other data that will tell you the same thing. Evidence of the past of Mars is to be found everywhere on Mars. And in fact, the rovers have probably encountered it and then kept rolling. Let me tell you something. A lot of the Mars explorers are geologists. They're hard rock geologists. If they found a lizard sitting on a rock on Mars, they would use the robot arm to brush it aside so they could get to the rock underneath, because that's all they care about. You may remember the frilly-looking shell that they found in one of the pictures. And then they said, oh no, that's just a piece of insulation from the landing. Yeah, and there was no, people at Roswell didn't know what a weather balloon looked like either. And what you discover is that the reason there was no follow-up on that is because if you follow the track of the rover, they rolled right over it and crushed it. So no one could talk about it anymore. But it looked just like a frilly seashell from the Caribbean. So once you look at the face of Mars and the abundant evidence of past Mars climate like Earth, you understand the secret of Mars, that Mars is the site of great life and great death. How did we end up on Mars? I mean, mentally. Someday people are going to go to Mars. I intend to go to Mars before I pass on from this vale of tears. I'm going to stand there in a spacesuit outside a Mars base. You watch, I'll do it. I'm doing everything I can to get us there quickly. But how did we end up as the human race confronting life and death on Mars? And to understand that journey, we must journey back in time, to ancient times again. The ancient times have spoken to us, basically pointing us at Mars from the beginnings of our culture on Earth. Of course, here's our old buddy, Mars the war god. I hope I'm not blocking anyone's view. Am I blocking people's? Okay, okay, well anyway, I'll try and move around a little bit. Anyway, you all know who this guy is. He was called Ares by the Greeks and Horus by the Egyptians. So, but Mars was not just a god of war, he was the inspirer of technology. You don't need swords to defend your flock from wolves. You do need your swords to defend your flock and your fields from the people over the hill or downriver. So he was the inspirer of cutting-edge technology from ancient times. Now, bridging, you must understand that by the time of Christ, astronomical and philosophical thinking about extraterrestrial life and cosmology had actually become extremely advanced, finally embodied in Aristarchus, who figured out that the Earth orbited the sun, that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that it spun 24 hours a day, that it was a round sphere floating in space. And the Greeks thought round things were perfect, so they thought it was very easy for them to accept the idea that the Earth was a round sphere. Aristotle writes, he says, well, it's obvious the Earth is a round sphere because it makes a round shadow on the moon. Aristarchus not only figured out the solar system, he measured its size. Now, that was all lost because of the collapse of the Roman Empire in the Dark Ages, and then rediscovered by Copernicus, the pole. And he was bridging across 2,000 years really to rediscover ancient wisdom. Now, Mars the planet went on to inspire Kepler because it had such an interesting orbit. Its orbit wasn't circular, like Copernicus had supposed. It was an oval, a beautiful Greek ellipse worked out by the ancient Greeks, as it turns out. The math had already been worked out for Kepler by the Greeks. He adopted it and found that the orbits of the planets were perfect Greek ellipses. And this led to the scientific revolution. Newton then explained with his law of gravity why the orbits were ellipses and developed calculus to solve for these orbits. So the whole scientific revolution was actually inspired by the planet Mars. Now, as telescopes got better, they could see Mars not just as a red point of light, but as a planet. And the Victorians believed very much in life on other planets. And they saw a planet, they saw the moon, looked airless, dead, but they saw Mars with polar caps, dust storms, clear clouds on its surface, and they just naturally assumed it was living. What Lowell found out was that if you looked at Mars carefully, it appeared there were canals. And he made elaborate maps of these canals. You can see one of his globes here in this picture. And you can see parts of it correspond to a modern picture of Mars. You must understand that in the Victorian era, cameras were so poor that the best optical instrument they had was the human eye. And if you look at the Earth if you look at Mars through the Earth's atmosphere, it's constantly being disturbed, like waves of heat on a summer day. And so you have to wait for the atmosphere to quiet down. Lowell built himself the best astronomy observatory in the world in Flagstaff, Arizona, where it was high, it was cold in the winter, so he had the best observatory. He saw canals, no one questioned him, at least not in the public. Other astronomers were more skeptical. However, everyone saw canals, and it apparently is the human eye's tendency to connect dots. But anyway, he got people convinced that not only was Mars alive, but it had intelligent life on it. So most of modern human history, people were convinced that Mars was alive and had maybe a civilization on it. Then Mars invaded Earth. H.G. Wells, who was British, and saw that the British had formed this world-girdling empire, sometimes not in too gentlemanly way. Apologies to my British colleagues. But you did a much better job than we've done in the past 20 years. But Mars, he basically presupposed that the people on Mars would behave like people on Earth that he knew so well would behave. And he had them invade Earth, and they used poison gas, they used directed energy weapons, and they had no regard whatsoever for human life. And so you had this, to the Victorian, people just coming out of the Victorian era, this was just a horrifying picture of human civilization being just completely destroyed by this technologically superior warlike power from the planet Mars. Now, one person who read this novel and was fascinated and decided he wanted to go to Mars was Robert Goddard. And he invented the liquid-fueled rocket. And there's his first rocket. There he is standing beside his first rocket. Oops. Right there, and it flew 40 feet. Not a really grand beginning, but it was a breakthrough. And soon his rocket flights began annoying the neighbors. And not only that, he wrote a book about rockets that annoyed the powers that be. Somebody took out an anonymous editorial in the New York Times attacking him. Now, let me put it this way. In a lot of countries, if somebody writes an anonymous editorial in a newspaper, major newspaper, attacking you, it's a good time to check your passport and leave the country. He decided, because he seemed to be annoying people, to move someplace, a nice quiet place to do his experiments where nothing ever happened and no one would ever notice him. So he packed up his rocket. There he is, half rocket will travel. There he is launching, and he moved to Roswell, New Mexico, where nothing ever happens. That's actually not true. Billy the Kid was running around Roswell, New Mexico, as it turns out. So it actually been kind of a place where a lot of things happen. But he was launching his rockets in Roswell, New Mexico in the 1930s, long before any weather balloons crashed there. And it's interesting. It's kind of a extraterrestrial pole of the Earth. And nobody in this country noticed much what he was doing, but the Germans did. Hitler had taken power, and he sent spies to Roswell, New Mexico to figure out everything that Goddard was doing. And they shipped all the information back to the Abwehr, the German military intelligence. So the V2 was actually a creation of Robert Goddard, unintentionally. But even before what didn't happen at Roswell that we don't want to talk about, Roswell was a center of international intrigue and conspiracy and great advances for human beings. I'm sure if we go back into the Native American lore about Roswell, we'll find out that that was a place where the shamans would meet and make medicine. It'd be very interesting to investigate that. But anyway, long before the crash at Roswell, Roswell figured greatly in the future of the human race. Now, of course, World War II happened, and somehow Wernher von Braun got to move to the United States, and with all of his buddies, and he wanted to go to Mars. And he had perfected during the war the type of rocket to get there. All he had to do was make it bigger. People say that von Braun wanted to go to the moon. He did, but that was just the first step. His real burning desire was to go to Mars. In fact, it crushed him when this country decided not to go past the moon to go to Mars. He said, all we have to do is keep going. and we will be on Mars. He thought we could be on Mars by 1980. But you must realize that when we began sending unmanned probes to Mars, that this was very much still guided by Lowell's vision of Mars with canals. Even though they hadn't found any canals, in 1970, they found the dried water channels. So Mars did have canals. They were just dried up. There were no princesses floating down them in barges, but but with a little imagination, you can imagine that it happened that way. And so, 1970, Mariner 9 found evidence that Mars had a much different past than its present indicates. Past was Earth-like, because the presence of liquid water defines what we call an Earth-like environment. Liquid water means life. Liquid water means pressure and temperatures that can support human life. And now, von Braun also was privy to the powers that be. The powers that be were deeply suspicious that Mars might have a civilization on it anyway. Because of Lowell, that idea was very deeply ingrained. And von Braun suggested the first astronauts should be archaeologists. So the powers that be in the Johnson-Nixon administrations actually were convinced that Mars might have a dead civilization on it. You could say that von Braun was in the loop as far as Mars was concerned. I've also talked to people who were veterans of JPL. They said when Mariner 9 approached Mars to take the first close-up pictures of Mars, it went into orbit so it could take close orbit pictures, that armed guards appeared at the photo lab when they were 2 weeks away from Mars. The explanation was they were worried about terrorism. This was back in 1970. But the real story, the scuttlebutt said, was they were worried they were going to take pictures of archaeology on Mars. They wanted to make sure that none of those pictures made it into the public viewing. So they were primed to find a dead civilization on Mars. Mars' global dust storm, by the way, helped end the Cold War. When the Mariner 9 reached close to Mars, they found that Mars was enveloped in a global dust storm. They'd never seen anything like that. Storms on Earth, moved from point A to point B. They didn't suddenly go up and down in the atmosphere like the Mars global dust storm. As you can see, it covered the entire surface from pole to pole, north to south. And this inspired Carl Sagan to realize this is what would happen to Earth if we had a nuclear war. We would have a Martian dust storm, and it would kill off whatever human beings survived the initial nuclear explosions and fallout. So that actually helped end the Cold War. So Mariner 9 survived the Great Dust Storm. Mariner 9 was an important breaking point in Mars research. It mapped all of Mars' total surface to 2-kilometer resolution. It took very high resolution pictures of about 1% of Mars, including Cydonia. However, the only pictures they'll release of the Mariner 9 pictures of Cydonia is dust clouds. They said, oh, it was covered by dust clouds. So Mariner 9 discovered the Great Canyon system and the extinct water channels and made people realize that Mars had been like Earth in the past. And here's some of the things they found. They found, of course, very straightforward looking water channels. Some people said that this was streams of liquid carbon dioxide, and I can tell you as a physicist, by the way, I'm a physicist. I got kind of distracted on Mars because of the Mars phase. But I can tell you that the most abundant element in the universe is hydrogen. And the next one is helium, which doesn't combine with anything. The third most abundant element in the universe is oxygen, as it turns out. No one in this universe should ever run out of oxygen if they have a power source. So water is a combination of the first most abundant element in the universe, hydrogen, with the third most abundant, oxygen. Water is the most abundant chemical compound in the universe. It's found every place. So when you find channels like this, the only fluid that can flow on Mars, conceivably, was water. And you can see from this one picture, this is what's called an oxbow lake. Those of you who are familiar with the river, the Mississippi, that's flown for millions of years, are aware of how many little oxbows. The river changes course over time and forms, then cuts off chunks of its old channel, forms oxbow lakes, and those are present on Mars. So that water on Mars didn't flow for just a little while. It flowed for millions of years, for thousands of miles. One thing the Mariner 9 did take pictures of was what apparently are pyramids in a region called Elysium. And it came back and took a second picture that most people have never seen. This is the picture of the pyramids of Elysium. You notice this kind of tetrahedron lines up with these two smaller pyramids. And there's another pyramid right there. And this is the pyramids at sunset, when the shadows are longest and it's easier to see. And here are the pyramids at morning, illuminated from the other side. And you can see that, yes, they look very much like they're carved. Apparently, someone on Mars took mountains, small mountains, and removed dirt and rock to make them look like this. They did not build them up brick by brick, apparently. They probably surfaced them with brick. In 1976, the Vikings landed on Mars. It was a triumph of American technology. Remember, everything that happened scientifically in space was part of the Cold War. When we landed 2 packages on Mars, 2 nuclear-powered landers, it made us look 10 feet tall, the United States that is, to the Russians, because they couldn't do that. And there you can see also kind of a bluish sky. This is one of the earlier pictures before they corrected the color balance. People have debated why they would correct the color balance on Mars. You can see the American flag looks right, and here's kind of a bluish sky. But if you look closely at the rocks, you'll find greenish, bluish areas on the rocks. Apparently the Mars sky became red because they didn't want people seeing green spots on the rocks. So the green spots disappeared when the blue sky disappeared. And Mars sky has been red because JPL says it's red ever since. And of course, in July of 1976, in preparation for landing at what was the prime landing site for the Viking probes, Cydonia Mensa, they took a picture that changed history, a picture of the face on Mars. And apparently it got out. I worked closely with Vince DiPietro, one of the original investigators, for which we owe a great debt. He was the original investigator of the face on Mars, and he told me that a source had told him that the release of the picture of the face on Mars was a quote-unquote screw-up. It wasn't supposed to happen. But apparently there was one part of the mission team for the Viking. They had been told they were going to land at Cydonia Mensa, where the face is. They didn't realize it was there, of course, when they chose that landing site. But then abruptly, another committee that they didn't realize was running the mission, they found out they weren't really actually running the mission. There was another council someplace. And they said, oh, you're not landing at Cydonia Mensa. It's too rocky. they're big rocks. You have to land someplace else. And the chief scientist of the mission, Hal Mazursky, was so angry that when he saw the face on Mars, he says, go ahead and release it, knowing that this would make people mad. So it was a little payback. The face on Mars got released because of some payback between two groups of scientists on the mission. A minor civil war. So the milk got spilled. The cat got let out of the bag. And of course, they came back and took another picture of the face on Mars, which NASA denied even taking for about 5 years. There it was in their photo catalogs, and yet NASA scientists would say, there is no second picture of the face. That's nonsense. And then they finally released a little press release saying, oh, we were mistaken, there is a second picture. And one very wise woman I spoke to, I briefed her on this, and she said, well, Cydonia is Mars. That is the entire Mars program now. Even though, of course, they don't ever even like to talk about it. So, because it tells you what's Mars past, it tells you in one picture what Mars past history is. And so, of course, we have two pictures based on that, and also we have a picture of a five-sided pyramid next to it. Down here, I intend to write a whole book on just the investigation of this. It's worth a whole book in itself. But suffice it to say that by the time DePietro and Molinar had seen both pictures of this face and the pyramid nearby, it was a no-brainer that they were looking at a dead civilization on Mars. And NASA tried to fire them, then found out that once again NASA was at war with itself. There were actually true scientists at Mars who were looking after Vince and Greg and gave them permission to do this investigation in writing, so that when they hauled them in front of an inquisition to fire them, they just presented the diary where they had the signed signature of the manager, and the inquisition said, oh, never mind. So now of course we have modern pictures. Here's a particularly telling one. It doesn't even show the whole face, but it shows the elements of the crown up here. And of course, the face is highly eroded. It does have nostrils, though, in the nose that couldn't be predicted based on the Viking pictures. And it looks very much like the Olmec heads. And one thing you'll notice about the Olmec heads is the helmets are often not symmetrical. The designs here, there'll be like a feature over one eye and a different feature over another. This one's been destroyed, but some of the ornaments on the helmets are symmetrical and some of them are not. The ornaments on the Mars head are apparently not symmetrical, and apparently there's a kind of eroded remainder of a element over one of the eyes. And as I said, this will be spoken about much more in the coming year. All archaeology on Earth is eroded. This is what the Sphinx used to look like before they dressed it up a little bit. They actually got out of some bag. I mean, we're talking the Egyptian government says the better the face of the Sphinx looks, the more tourist dollars we will get. So archaeology aside, they went out with a couple bags of concrete and patched up the face of the Sphinx. They couldn't do anything about the nose. That was shot off by Napoleon, as it turns out, in the same. So you had parts of Napoleon's expedition were doing honest archaeology, and the other parts of Napoleon's army were doing epic vandalism. So they shot the nose off the Sphinx with a cannonball. But you can see, here's a face with sort of a helmet or headdress and ornaments, and of course, 2 eyes, nose, and a mouth. But some people say they look at this and they don't see a face. They don't know what I'm talking about. Now, something else happened very importantly in more recent times in Egypt. A rock fell out of the sky and killed a dog. And there are millions of meteorites that fall on Earth every year. Some large, some small. Most of them burn up in the atmosphere. This is the only meteorite reported to have killed a living thing. Apparently the dog was out barking at the moon the previous night. And so the god of the sky got back at him the next day. And this shows you something very interesting. As I say, the meteorite that killed this dog came from Mars. There are millions of meteorites that fall on the Earth. Only 1 in a million meteorite is from Mars. Most of them for the asteroid belt. But this was the one that killed the dog. And I said to people, this shows you, to a scientist, pure scientist, this means nothing, but to the poet, such as I also am, this speaks volumes. For one thing, it tells you Mars has bad karma. As it's interestingly enough, the Norse version of Mars was named Tyr, and he hated dogs. He was in charge of trying to, he was the version in Asgard of dog catcher. He was trying to corral this kind of big wolf dog, and the only way he could get it done was to tie it up, but it chewed his hand off in the process. So there he is, very upset. There's the dog all tied up, and there's his hand in the mouth, and he's, this guy is saying, don't kill my dog. If you kill my dog, there'll be terrible trouble. And the guy says, well, he just bit my hand off. Now this quarrel with the canine species goes all the way on to Goddard-Damarung, the great last battle of the gods, where once again Tyr is in charge of taking care of the big devil dog from hell named Gother or somebody. Here he is. There's Tyr with his missing hand. You can't see where this, and he's about to take out this dog. Here's the heroes of Valhalla charging into battle. There's Thor about to slay a big serpent. That's their version of the Battle of Armageddon, by the way. When I read this thing, I'm half Icelandic. Tears came to my eyes reading about all of this last battle of the gods. But anyway, what's fascinating is the ancient Mars of the Norse hated dogs, and this meteorite from Mars kills a dog. I thought that was interesting. But this led, by the way, the discovery of that Nakola was from Mars, along with several other meteorites, led to the discovery of ALH 8401, the Mars meteorite. And unlike Nakola, which is actually quite recent, Nakola is a lava, and from a recent volcanic eruption on Mars, it's only like 1 billion years old. That's considered recent geology. ALH 8401 is 4.5 billion years old. It's dates from the foundation of Mars and all the planets. All the moon rocks are 4.5 billion years old, at least the most oldest ones. The oldest Earth rocks they can find are 4.2 billion years old. So this rock speaks to us from the distant geologic past. It is a time capsule. It's a riddle from the ancient past. Now, I want you to know that we have quiet, in the middle of all of the volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, wars and rumors of wars in the Middle East, we have now, the human race, all of us have passed into a new age. We are now in the age of the living cosmos. Life on early Mars has been confirmed. It's been confirmed by two different methods. First, they have ALH-8401, and it's a lava, has a vein of a iron-rich dolomite in it, deposited by water. In that, they found little fossil microfossils, and inside the microfossils, they found little bits of magnetite, which are found in earth bacteria to help the earth bacteria navigate. Apparently, being able to line north-south and travel north-south for a bacteria helps them find food better. And they especially find this in primitive rocks on Earth. So there's what's called magnetotactic bacteria. So apparently these existed on Mars. And they found now these magnetites, which are perfect crystals laid down by biological organisms in rock that doesn't even have any iron in it. The only place the iron could have come from is bacteria crawled up crevices in this dolomite. The dolomite changes composition from being iron-rich in one area to being just calcium-rich, pure limestone in another. They find it now in pure limestone. There is only one way the magnetite could have gotten there. Bacteria had to crawl there and die. So they have found evidence of really proof of life on Mars. That's the first method, and that only happened in the last year. The second path is what I was involved in. Since I knew that Mars was alive in the past, I went looking for meteorites where microfossils were reported. And there's a group of exotic meteorites called Ci carbonaceous chondrites, and they're oil shale from space. They're soaked in a tar, it's like a shale-like hardened clay soaked in a tar, like oil shale is. It's 2% organic matter. There are 9 of these meteorites they've found. They're full of microfossils. People dismiss the reports of microfossils by saying, oh, it's contamination from hitting the Earth. People have now broken open recently the meteorites to the very center that has not seen water for 4.5 billion years. These are also time capsule meteorites from the ancient times. And they found microfossils embedded in them. And these meteorites come from Mars, as it turns out. And I published that in 1996. I just published a final article. No one is arguing with me anymore. The isotopes in the rock mineralogy is Mars. In fact, it matches ALH-8401. These meteorites, the Ci, complete with their microfossils, were neighbors of this rock on Mars, except they're not lavas. People said, they can't be from Mars, they're not lava. Well, the isotopes and the rock chemistry doesn't lie, they're from Mars. So that's how that has been settled. So congratulations, you now live in a living cosmos. It's a scientific fact. So that was primitive life on a faraway planet a long time ago. It's very non-threatening to the human race. This isn't little gray guys crashing your spaceship in your backyard. This is a rock with signs of bacteria in it. And the government is basically bringing along the public. It's acceptable and non-threatening to the public that there was primitive bacteria on early Mars, you must admit. However, you start talking about carved faces on Mars, Uncle Sammy will get very nervous and issue press releases saying that's not so. You must realize that your Uncle Sam likes to play his cards close to the chest on matters of this type. But you must also admit that he is slowly releasing data. And now we live in a living cosmos. Now, what happens when we realize we take all this data and put it on the table? When a scientist wants to say, oh, I'm going to put some stuff in a test tube and it's going to turn bright orange when I add something else, that's a hypothesis. That's kind of looking at a tree in a forest. When a scientist wants to talk about the whole forest, or a forest fire, or something like that, that's a synthesis. He's bringing together a lot of data to try and paint a whole picture. Not just a little teeny part of the picture, but the whole picture. So it's possible now to make a new Mars synthesis. A synthesis brings together a wide range of data to try and paint a whole story or picture. And this is what the new Mars synthesis is. This is ancient Mars. It looked a lot like Earth, had a big ocean, and was a living planet like the Earth. Turns out how this happened because Mars and Venus find something in common. They shared it in Greek mythology. Mars and Venus shared a torrid affair, and this was changed in the Roman mythology that Venus had basically cheated on her husband Vulcan with Mars, and it was kind of a admonition to all young men in ancient Rome to join the army and be like Mars so that your wife would stay faithful. So it turns out what Mars and Venus had in common is that they had greenhouses. Venus has had a strong carbon dioxide greenhouse for 4.5 billion years. And in fact, it's so effective that even though Venus is twice as far from the sun as the planet Mercury, it's twice as hot because of the CO2 greenhouse. And Venus demonstrates you can have a persistent greenhouse, and Mars apparently had the same sort of greenhouse. And Carl Sagan was the first person to explore this. He also found something else. He found that if you had a greenhouse on Mars, because of Mars' distance from the sun, that greenhouse could collapse catastrophically, and leading to a planet-wide catastrophe, like something that we know something about from the flood stories of ancient mythology, a mass extinction caused by climate change. So Carl had found that this had happened, or was possible, and this allows us to understand how Mars could go from being like this to what it looks like now. Carl Sagan essentially discovered it, and I cite him in my book. Carl Sagan and I actually had a lot of fun discussions about the face on Mars, by the way. I was sitting there in my office. We had presented a paper on the face on Mars at a Mars conference, and I got this phone call. And this was back in about 1984. And I said, "Who's this?" And he says, "It's Carl Sagan." And he said, "Why are you causing this trouble on Mars? You're endangering Mars science," he says. And I said, "I'm a scientist, we're doing Mars science." And we got an argument, but we had a few fun discussions. We ended up discussing Mars climate history. And that's when I became aware that he had found the possibility that Mars climate could collapse catastrophically. Basically, Mars is so far from the sun that the temperature at its poles gets below the condensation point for dry ice. So basically, the questions are, how long did Mars and Earth have similar climates? The answer is about 4 billion years. Did Mars have life? Yes. It not only had life, it had a biosphere, making oxygen, ozone layer, ocean full of life, dolphins, octopus, stuff like that. Did Mars Earth-like climate persist long enough for Mars life to evolve? Yes, it did. What level of complexity did Mars life reach? Complex enough to carve big humanoid faces. So we found out there was a Paleocean. Cydonia stood on the shoreline of it. It was kind of the Riviera of Mars. That's why they wanted to land on it until they found the face there and decided. So Mars Polar Lander recently landed on this old ocean bed and found that it's dust. It's basically a layer of dust covering ice. So there's a whole frozen ocean under there. So the old ocean, come on. This is, by the way, what killed Mars. It's called the Leo impact crater. And it's about 200 kilometers across. It's as big as the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. And if you look at the age of craters on Mars that they've done, they find that just about the time of this impact occurred very late in Mars history, Mars erosion rate due to liquid water dropped dramatically. So that's when the climate collapsed. And that was roughly, this event happened roughly about 500 million years ago. There weren't any cockroaches on this planet when that happened. Earth was just a backwater. So the new Mars synthesis is that, in particular, a greenhouse stabilized northern ocean and oxygen had a persistent greenhouse. Mars had a massive biosphere, it had biological evolution. The greenhouse was destroyed by an impact causing a mass extinction. And so we had Mars going from something like this to this. And this is our welcome to the cosmos, you guys. This cosmos is a very tough place, and terrible things happen in this cosmos. You must prepare yourselves for that, and make sure that terrible things don't happen to you. Now, Mars is next to the asteroid belt, so it's very easy to imagine that Mars got hit by a big asteroid and died a natural death, except for one problem. Mars appears to have suffered a massive nuclear explosion just about the same time as its climate collapsed. And the reason is that we know when we set off hydrogen bombs on Earth, as we used to do in open air, what they tend to do with a hydrogen bomb nowadays, guys, is they wrap it in uranium, depleted uranium, the same thing they use in anti-tank rounds. And that uranium splits when the hydrogen bomb goes off. And this doubles the yield of the hydrogen bomb. And it also releases, when they do that, a large amount of xenon-129. This is the gun smoke of the smoking gun. Xenon-129 in the Earth's atmosphere is almost all due, at least the recent changes in xenon are due to nuclear weapons tests on Earth. It is only created in violent nuclear explosions, either a supernova or a hydrogen bomb test on Earth. And Mars' atmosphere looks like an enormous nuclear test occurred there. If you take the xenon produced by a nuclear test and match it to Mars, the match is very good. Mars is red and the nuclear test xenon is yellow. And if you mix kind of equal parts natural Earth xenon and nuclear test xenon, then you get very close to Mars. Here's the mixed Earth and nuclear test, and here's Mars xenon. So the only way you get xenon-129 is by splitting uranium atoms in a violent nuclear reaction. Now, we also found out some of the Mars meteorites apparently were irradiated strongly with neutrons, as if from an explosion. Not only that, orbiting probes could actually look at gamma rays from the Mars surface because the Mars atmosphere is so thin now, gamma rays go right through it. Both the Russians and the United States found large amounts of potassium, radioactive potassium, thorium, and uranium on the Mars surface. And we have Mars rocks, the Mars meteorites. They have much less uranium and thorium than they find on the top level of the surface. So there's a thin layer of radioactive stuff all over Mars. Friends, this is a no-brainer. Somebody set off a big nuke on Mars about the same time its climate collapsed. So you have kind of a evidence of a death by a natural cause, and then death by something absolutely mind-boggling and unearthly. Here's the radioactive hotspot on Mars left by this explosion. Here it is in potassium. Here it is in thorium, same spot. The debris wraps around the planet and forms another hotspot on the exact opposite side of the planet called the antipode. It left no crater. It looks like it was an airburst. This is similar to what happened in Siberia, only the Siberian explosion, there's no evidence it was nuclear. But that happened out in Siberia, and this is the result. It looked like Mount St. Helens. This event, explosion, occurred. Here's the Leo impact crater. Here's the explosion site, and there's Cydonia. What's that? I'm sorry. Anyway, it looks like that area of Mars was very accident prone. All sorts of strange stuff happened there. People carved big heads and then terrible things happened. So it looks as if someone was targeting somebody on Mars. Maybe that's why the face of Mars looks so unfriendly, staring up at the sky, growling at it. So Mars may have been the site of both massive life and also massive tragedy. We must prepare ourselves for that. However, you are not alone. Not only you're not alone that we share the universe with other living forms of flesh and blood, but in a philosophical sense, you have never been alone. We're now in a living cosmos, but this is not a new idea. This goes back also to very ancient times. In some ways, the ancients were wiser than we were. And this doctrine was called infinite worlds. The idea that the universe was full of inhabited planets like ourselves was from the Greek philosophers, which, by the way, instructed the Apostle Paul. So Jesus and Paul were both very aware of these possibilities because they preceded by about a few hundred years the time of Christ. Anaxagoras proposed the sun and moon and stars were huge fiery stones and the earth was round. He was imprisoned for this. Don't think that narrow-mindedness is a modern invention. The ancient Greeks were very upset because he was deemed to be discrediting the gods. But there he is arguing about the round earth. And Democritus proposed infinite worlds like Earth with living beings on them. He's called the laughing philosopher. There he is laughing. He proposed everything was made of atoms, and the atoms that made up the moon and the sun and the stars are the same as the atoms that made us up. He was the father of democracy philosophically, because he said the people who want to rule over us, they're made of the same stuff we are. Why are we worshiping them? So, then finally Aristarchus, shortly thereafter, proposed the sun in the center of the solar system, full of round planets, essentially a completely modern cosmology. This was 200 years before Christ. And so the age of Christ and the apostles was influenced by Greek cosmic thinking. When Jesus tells his disciples to go out into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, he uses, written in Greek, the word cosmos for world. He's saying, go out into all the cosmos. And Paul, who was highly educated, he had basically a PhD in rabbinical studies and a PhD in Greek philosophy, was fully aware of all this. He wrote that the mission of the church is to inform kingdoms in heavenly places of the manifold wisdom of God. So he was quite acquainted, apparently, with the idea of life on other planets. What happened to change the human race from this? That the idea of at the time of Christ, when all the Gospels were written, within 200 years of Christ's ministry, is where everything was cosmic. What happened was the collapse of Rome. Imagine the Hell's Angels riding into town, burning down all the libraries, taking everything. There's no more internet, there's no more cable TV, there's no more radio stations, there's no more phone service. Everything is destroyed by a bunch of people. Instead of riding big motorbikes, they ride horses. The Dark Ages followed. Only ideas sanctioned and blessed by the church survived. Everything else was wiped clean. The simplest idea the church could grasp was that the earth was the center of everything, and that's what they taught. Anybody who taught anything else, they had a barbecue in their honor. So that's how we ended up in the present dark. We live in an extension of the Dark Ages. But we have rediscovered an ancient mode of thought. What's interesting is that even though the church ran everything in the Dark Ages, the scriptures were written far before that, in the time of the Roman Empire, when things were quite relaxed. And all of the Greek philosophy of the time of Christ is incorporated in the New Testament that we have, in the Greek. So it's a time capsule. Just like the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs speak to us, if you look in the Greek of the New Testament, it's all in there. Unfortunately, it was translated later into English, so cosmos was translated as world, etc. Became very narrow. But if you studied in the ancient Greek, it's all the Greek philosophy is there. In fact, the word logos, which is applied to Jesus, is a Greek philosophic. The spirit of truth from ancient Greek philosophy that far precedes Christ. So, the Bible actually records cosmic thinking, even though we don't think so. So people running around saying, and I was raised as a fundamentalist family, I heard from in several sermons there was no extraterrestrial life because it isn't mentioned in the Bible. And that's nonsense. It's mentioned it's implied in the Greek. It's there in the Greek. But modern times and modern translations erased it. So, but the Bible records cosmic thinking. So, and I'm just an Episcopalian and kind of a mystic Christian. Some would read flaky Christian, but for people who believe in God, we've never been alone anyway. So, what we need to understand is how do we respond to this? We're now in a new situation. We look out at the stars at night, and some of them are looking right back at us. We may even have visitors occasionally. And there are two reactions we can do. One, we can turn inward, do what we've been doing, continue the Dark Ages, or we can resolve that we're going to find our destiny in this new living cosmos. And I say we should respond positively and dynamically to the living cosmos. We must go to Mars, go back to the moon, and Mars is the gateway to the stars. The human future will include Mars. We will occupy and restore the Mars biosphere. One of the things that's going to help that is we have new breakthroughs in propulsion that are coming. And I have written a book about this. Like I said, I am actually a physicist, not a planetologist. I kind of got on Mars as a distraction, partly because I'm a space cadet. But we have now been able to make great progress and unify gravity and E&M. Means we can bend space-time with E&M fields. I believe this is the physics used at Site 51, and it's in my book. I may have had an opportunity to work at Site 51, but I said, I think I'll pass. And I was never bothered again. But at the same time, people started inviting me to conferences. People from the government. They wanted this stuff to come out, apparently. So, and I don't want to spoil the book for you, but the answer to the secret of the universe, of life and everything is 42.8503, just like in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Douglas Adams was very close. By the way, I've traced back his use of the number 42 to Alice in Wonderland, which was Rule 42. All people more than a mile high must leave the courtroom. This was invoked by the king to Alice. So anyway, the answer is 42.85. That is the number that, by the way, unifies E&M and gravity, and also unifies hydrogen, protons and electrons, with the vacuum itself. So we've made great progress. This book is available when? Right here. I will sign any copy for anyone. And I'm very proud of this book. And here's old Nick Tesla. He's in the book. And here's old Al Einstein. And here's this strange Frisbee-shaped craft that you can build after reading this book. So I say, boldly go. Thank you very much.